Here is today's economic update for our Patreon community. I want to talk about the explosive increase in global debt, borrowings by corporations, governments, and households. I want to speak briefly because it's a kind of alert that has to be put out there and which hasn't been put out there by the mass media, which should come as no great surprise. The reasons for it and the implications are arresting. First, the reasons. At the end of the crisis of 2008 and 9, when global capitalism came close to a general collapse, desperate governments around the world, led by the Federal Reserve here in the United States, responded with a monetary policy that involved flooding the economy with new money and making it very, very cheap for anyone to borrow money, particularly corporations, as they drove interest rates down not only to zero, but into negative territory in various parts of the world, including the United States. Making the borrowing of money unspeakably cheap, so cheap that it has no historical precedent for so much money to be available at so little cost, you had the predictable capitalist result. Corporations solved every problem they could encounter by borrowing virtually costless money. Why not? Politicians in power did the same, borrowed relatively costless money at incredibly low interest rates. In the United States, it was possible for the government, as the Treasury, to borrow money at record low interest rates, which the other arm of the government, the Federal Reserve, had pushed down close to zero. The result is that we've had an explosion of debt, corporate debt and government debt in the United States and globally. Excuse me. For the mass of people, household debt has also exploded, but there the reason is different. Capitalism is not paying people wages sufficient to experience decent housing, decent education, decent medical care, a decent life, whether you call it the American dream or the European dream or any other thing. It's less of a dream, as one jokester said, and more of a nightmare. Because the salaries and wages paid are too low, and the cost of the advertised American or other dream is too high, the solution for households has been to borrow unprecedented amounts of money. Let me simply give you one overall statistic. The total amount of debt in the world, money borrowed by corporations, governments, and households, rose between 1999 and this year, 2019, a period of 20 years, by tripling. That's right. It tripled in the last 20 years over what it was in 1999. By any reasonable historical standard, that is an unprecedented explosion of debt. That's not a sign of a successful economy. It's a sign of the opposite. It's a system that does not provide people with the incomes, the wealth, the security they need, and then forces them to borrow to provide their children with what was promised and what was hoped as parents to give them. We have a society that has said to corporations, here's free money. Take enormous risks because it's with money it doesn't cost you much. We've said to politicians, solve your problem. Avoid taxing the rich who will throw you out of office if you dare. and don't tax the mass of people much more because they'll vote you out. Solve the problem by borrowing money. And here's the implication. We are now so deeply indebted that governments and corporations, and including households, are borrowing more to pay off the debts that are already more than they can handle. This is a spiral into depravity of an economic sort. The next economic downturn, which all reasonable economists see coming within the next 6 to 18 months, will mean failures in economics that ramify, as all the people and companies that have difficulty will immediately plunge others into difficulty because they can't pay the debts that those others count on being paid. We live in an extremely sketchy, dangerous period of capitalism's history. Many signs pointing to a system spinning out of control. I don't mean to be an alarmist, but if you did not take seriously this unprecedented debt explosion, you'd be fooling first and foremost yourself.